This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Here we are wrapping up the end of the year, and we notice that if you keep track of our titles of our episodes, this is episode 53. Last I checked, there are only 52 weeks in the year.
That'd be my understanding. Yeah.
So apparently, the whole calendar issue, we have 53 episodes this year. So you, as our listeners, we're giving this to you as a Christmas present, a bonus episode for the year 2024.
Bonus after class episode. Free at no charge.
Yeah, this one's free. The rest will cost you, as
That's
you know.
right.
However,
there's
a caveat. If you want to start the new year with the After Class Podcast, you'll have to go to an old episode because we're not going to have one at the very beginning of the year. John will be out of the country. Ron will be somewhere, and I'll just be tired. And so, we will not have an episode to begin the new year, but we will get in the swing of things in the second week of 2025.
Spend that time more with your family, less
with us
in your earbuds. Earmuffs.
Yep.
Whatever you use.
Didn't we do that in a previous episode? We said something about earmuffs.
We probably did.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
That was a long time ago.
Everything comes full circle with this world. So, we hope you enjoy it because we wanted to wrap up Micah before we ended the year, and we are again being out of town and not together. So that's the way it's going to go.
Well, the one thing we don't do is like if one of us can't be here, we don't just plow on ahead or anything like that. It's like you got to have the core three in here. We'll bring other guests on. We've done that with other people, but
although it's been a while.
It has been a while since we've had a
Well,
guest.
Greg wants to get back on.
I'm sure he does.
Sure. We'll get him in there.
He feels like his premiere episode wasn't as good as he wanted. He wants another shot at it.
Well, we didn't get the full Greg in that moment. So
some people were praising God for that.
Yes. Do we really want the full Greg?
The full Stauffer. Got to give people the full Stauffer experience.
Those who have ears, let them hear. That's you, Greg.
Are you listening? Listening, Greg?
So for those who want to know how we're doing, in general,
tired.
as we wrap up the year, we have around 560,000 unique downloads. So
not just this year, to be clear.
Yeah.
Throughout the
people are still listening to us. We don't have this listenership where 1 million people listen to us.
We're not Joe Rogan.
Yes.
Well
done.
Not even close. But we get at least 1,000 downloads a week average. So, yeah, apparently every once in a while, it's like, are people still listening out there? Apparently they are. It's still at a steady click. And so, probably 900 of you, we don't know who you are. And so thanks for listening.
Yeah, big thank you.
And I think it's amazing, like whenever we check the stats every now and then, to see that there have been 560,000 downloads of this podcast. That's remarkable to me. And granted, we've been doing this now. We're the next time you hear from us, we'll be in our 8th season of doing this. And so it's a long time for a podcast to keep going. But it's still really remarkable that many people have chosen to listen to us. And I'm really grateful for that. It means a lot that we're providing a service that people value and keep coming back and listening. So thank you to all of you who are listening. We really, really appreciate it.
To be clear, I have also skewed the numbers because every time I set up an older person for the podcast, I automatically download every new episode.
Right?
So like, oh, you haven't heard our podcast? Here, I'll put it in your little thing.
You're drumming up the numbers for advertisers.
I do what I can. do what I can.
All those advertisers that Ron keeps threatening that we might have.
They're beating down the doors.
I keep saying
and then never
do
delivers.
So I've always threatened to put advertisements in here, and I haven't done it yet. And people are like, I thought Ron said he was going to put ads in here. Eventually, I will get to that. Eventually, I will make it happen. It's just we've been so busy with other things. So maybe season 8 will be the final season where you start hearing some ads in this thing.
Or the final season period.
Or the first season you start hearing ads.
Or did I say final? Yeah, first season. It's the end of the semester. We need to finish up this
It's the
Micah
final
thing.
week of the semester. Okay.
Yeah.
So we are wrapping up our Micah series. We've made it all the way to chapter 7. For those of you who are keeping track of the structure, that means we're in the 3rd oracle, and where the first 7 verses of chapter 7 wrap up the doom section. And then beginning in verse 8, we transition to the hope section, the hope that wraps up the book.
Try to end on a nice note. So I'll start in 7:1, and I'll go through verse 7, if that's okay with you all. Doesn't matter, we're going. Woe is me. I have become like one who, after the summer fruit has been gathered, after the vintage has been gleaned, finds no cluster to eat. There is no first ripe fig for which I hunger. The faithful have disappeared from the land. There's no one left who is upright. They all lie in wait for blood. They hunt each other with nets. Their hands are skilled to do evil. The official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate what they desire. Thus they pervert justice. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them like a thorn hedge. The day of their sentinels of their punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a friend. Have no confidence in a loved one. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. But as for me, I will look to Yahweh. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me.
That's dark.
Me.
Roar.
Right?
It ends with Micah kind of lamenting over the state of Israel. He's mourning for what's happening among his people as society continues to break down. Things like faithfulness and honesty and trust have all left. And it's kind of like this gangrene rot that began is now expanded to the whole nation and permeated it. And so even relationships between friends and family are crumbling as well. And the family, which is such an important part of Israelite culture, is breaking down. And if that's happening, we're in bad shape.
Yeah, and that's what really stood out to me is like this is all about relationships. It's not even talking about some of the major social justice things that we often see in the prophets. But here, it's like friends and family. You can't trust them. Don't put any confidence in them. And that's what makes it just so dark to me is that kind of a lament that the people closest to you are completely untrustworthy.
Yeah, I like how it begins with the imagery. He's looking for fruit, for good things, and he finds nothing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this is probably not a good illustration, but you ever have something that you bought and you put in the refrigerator and you're looking forward to eating it and you go to eat it and it's gone because someone else has eaten it?
Oh, that's the worst thing.
Yeah. I feel that's what he's feeling, but probably on a more serious level, because he looks for the fruit, the goodness, when you harvest, as a farmer, like going and getting that fruit right off the vine and eating it, that fruit, like it's wonderful. Right? There's nothing like picking something right off the vine and eating it fresh and ready to go.
Well, it's funny because it did make me think of something that happened a few years ago where, I have a fence around my garden, but back then it was just like a 5-foot high fence that I thought was enough. Turns out deer don't care.
They
about
laughed
that.
at you.
They
and
just
laughed.
mocked me.
They mock you.
And I went out there one day to check my blueberries, and it went from this giant crop. In 24 hours, there were none left.
Wow.
Because they came in and they ate all of them. And my fury cannot be put into words.
And Ron became a hunter that day.
Yeah.
I'm just a farmer.
I was literally threatening to fill my freezer with venison that year. So now there's a 7-foot fence, and that keeps them out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's that disappointment, right?
It was.
He's looking for things. It's just not there. I will also say on a side note, for me, I don't know much better than a fresh grape off the vine. It's like eating a gusher. The candy, it's like they're so good. I don't know if you guys ever had that experience, but just a fresh.
Since I was a kid.
Oh man, it's just so good.
Not good grapes.
Oh yeah, there's gross.
Yeah.
A lot of that stuff out there.
Yeah, so I think, if you're trying to think out who exactly he's talking about there, I think it's interesting in verse 3, even though the prophecies are kind of all-inclusive in that, the faithful have disappeared from the land altogether, right? And you can't even trust your wife, right? In the intimacy of your own home, you can't share what's going on with your wife because you can't even trust her. But it centers, I think, gets more specific in verse 3, that the officials and the judge ask for a bribe, right? The powerful dictate what they desire, and they pervert justice. The best of them is like a briar. And it talks about the sentinels, right? The people who should be the watchmen for the people. And, I say that only to say that, if the leaders, the ones who should be guiding them, cannot be trusted and are not leading them well, then the whole nation goes to rot. Mm-hmm. And so I think this oracle, even though it's kind of all-inclusive, when it does focus on a specific people group, it's the leaders. Mm-hmm. And I think there is this connection that the oracle makes between, as the leaders go, so do the masses. And so I think there's a warning about leaders and being careful about the influence they wield. and the way it impacts, the rest of the congregation.
Yeah. Shout it out.
Yeah, there's a song by John Foreman called "Equally Skilled." And it's taken from this verse about their hands are equally skilled to do evil and perverting justice. It's really quite a good song and very poignant about how people should be better. Yeah. I also say, just a side note, I was reading through some commentaries, and the daughter-in-law against mother-in-law, and that's a sort of a phrase that doesn't come up very often in the text. And the only comment was, I think it just goes to show that when a daughter is folded into the family, now the mother-in-law has authority over her. And so the daughter-in-law is rising up against her mother-in-law, who is her authority. Because the whole Genesis, leave the family and leaving that, it's reversed now, where the guy was supposed to leave, and now as culture's gone, the woman leaves and joins this other family. But it's kind of like she has left her blood family, and now she's under this authority of this new family, her husband's family. That's kind of why that's in there, I guess.
Yeah, and the mother-in-laws can usually expect that, their daughter-in-laws are trying to earn their respect, earn their favor. Like, I married into this family, I better have a good relationship with my mother-in-law.
It's only seemed wise, right?
That would seem the wise thing to do.
And so when even the daughter-in-laws don't try, now it's kind of, that's a sign that, another sign that it's all gone to seed.
Yeah. Next section.
Please.
All right, 8 through 10, Micah 7. Do not rejoice over me, my enemies. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. I must bear the indignation of the Lord because I have sinned against him, until he takes my side and executes judgment for me. He will bring me out to the light. I shall see his vindication. Then my enemies will see, and shame will cover those who said to me, where is the Lord your God? My eyes will see their downfall. Now they will be trodden down like the mire of the streets. And so here we have this hopeful turn. This is like that. I was thinking about a different podcast, a term that we use in the other one, this eucatastrophe, where bad turns to good. I know it's not a Bible term, but it's something we always talk about. So he says that don't rejoice. He's saying to me, the enemies, you guys think that I am going to fall, and you're about ready to celebrate my destruction. But it's not going to be me who turns it around, but Yahweh, the Lord. He is going to turn things around. And so I like that. It's that confidence in him that even though I have sinned, even though things are going bad, that God hasn't forgotten about me. This is not the end of the story. But despite my own lack of allegiance, God has not turned away from me. And I think that's really encouraging even to this very day. This is not just an Old Testament thing. The same God that Micah or whoever is putting his faith in is the God that we worship. And so we can know that, we're going to make mistakes. And yes, sometimes we're going to have to deal with the consequences of our mistakes. But God is not going to turn his back on us.
And it's this kind of Old Testament and New Testament conviction that, God will see to it that we are delivered from our enemies.
Yeah.
Like vengeance belongs to the Lord
Yeah.
because he's the one who promises to vindicate us.
Mm-hmm.
And so this prophet has that conviction, and so he can have a certain kind of perspective on enmity that others would have a hard time having.
Yeah, agree.
So it's interesting. He makes it very personal. He says, I will bear the indignation of Yahweh because of what I've done against him. And yet he seems to be standing for the nation, because it's not like Micah or the writer has a necessarily a personal offense against God. I mean, other than being a sinful humanity, right? And so it's kind of interesting where it does seem very personal, but it does seem to be speaking for the nation, right? Like, you could just put we're going to bear God's indignation until God executes judgment for us. Then the enemies will see. And the enemies can be both right here in direct context, those rulers who are terrible and perverting justice. It could be expanded a little bit wider to Assyrians or Babylonians. But either way, it's just kind of interesting how he does this, where he uses the I when it's definitely the we.
I wonder if part of the reason for that is it becomes a prayer that other people can take up. He's saying I, but others are going to read this, or if they're illiterate, memorize it. And so they can make this their own prayer, just as Micah prayed this. So too, I am coming to you, the Lord, and saying the same prayer. Again, I'm confessing my own sin. I'm not trying to cover it up. I know I'm a sinner. Yet at the same time, God, I know that I can approach you with the same level of confidence. And so that I becomes more than just something Micah can say, but it becomes something that others can repeat, as this maybe becomes sort of a staple of their prayers.
Yeah, this actually kind of starts in verse 7. But as for me,
Yeah.
I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. I thought we had another verse like this. I was just quickly looking for it. I couldn't find it. Where he talks about the other prophets and other leaders. But as for me, I will do it right. So I think maybe among the prophets or among the leaders, he sees himself as he's in a personal battle against his enemies, which would be other leaders, other prophets, who are the preachers of strong drink that he kind of outs earlier. But he sees himself as standing in contrast. So I wonder if it's some in-house, there are different leaders that the people are gravitated toward. Don't follow the leaders who go in one direction. Follow people like me who go another direction. And it's true, if God is the one vindicating him, then all who are aligned with him and all the righteous in Israel get to share in his vindication. And so I think he probably thinks he's not utterly alone, but there are several in Israel who have been on his side.
Yeah.
Right, and on the side of the oppressed, or maybe they are the oppressed. And so his deliverance is their deliverance. Were you guys able to find it?
Yeah,
Well,
3:8.
3:8. Yeah, what's
Okay,
the
yeah,
context
because I was
there?
looking at one right before that, so. Or
Yeah.
I'm sorry, right after that, I should
The idea
say.
is that the prophets say peace, but there's no peace, and they go, they're going to go dark. They're going to not be able to say anything. But for me, I'm filled with power, Spirit of Yahweh, justice and might to declare these things, as opposed to all the other, like I said, all the other prophets who were going against it.
Right, yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for finding that. It was kind of driving me crazy for a little bit.
I mean, you're vindicated, right? You're correct. There was that passage in there. You're right.
We got to
And the
scratch
whole
that
loaf
brain
rises.
itch.
Yes, amen. So, question, Ron, what do you think, Jaron, what do you think about this idea of darkness and light imagery? Do you think John picks up in this in chapter 1, or is it just because light and dark imagery is just so common, there's not a clear connection?
Oh no, I've made this argument a lot that I think John is way more engaged with the Old Testament than people give him credit for. Not that people think he's not at all, but I think it shows up in places where people maybe aren't entirely aware of. Because people will sometimes want to interpret John in more of like a Greco-Roman context. And I'm not saying John's unaware of that it's outside the realm, but I think that you're making a really good point, that I think John is really immersed in the Hebrew scriptures, and that those are influencing not just the way he thinks, but even his wording at times. And so it's kind of hard to prove, I'm not saying it definitively, but I think you can make a very good, compelling argument that when he talks about like this idea of darkness and light, that in some small way, he's still being influenced by the scriptures he knows. In fact, a passage like this might go a long way to explaining why he chooses to use that imagery. And so I think you're making a great observation that when you see that, it's like, oh, that sounds a little bit like John. Well, maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe John was influenced by this passage.
And part of why that's important is some people see John's dualisms, the duality between good and evil, light and darkness, and they read that in light of Platonic dualism.
Yeah.
Right, between physicality and spirituality,
Right, yeah.
and they accuse John of being an early version of a Gnostic.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, this dualism of light dark, which you see a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yeah.
right, and it goes back to the earliest writing prophets,
Yeah.
the 8th century prophets. So there's a very Jewish dualism between light and dark, good and evil. That's a moral dualism and not a ontological kind of spiritual dualism.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, and in the last couple of years, I've even tried to avoid using the language of dualism, only because I know how it's used in philosophical stuff like that. I'll talk maybe a binary or something like that, but trying to kind of jettison that language because it automatically takes people into like Platonism or whatever. But that idea of a binary between light and darkness as we've already said, very, very Jewish. And I'm glad you brought it up, John, because you do see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. And so we don't have to sort of pivot over into something that's foreign to John, but let John be the Jewish writer that he is.
All right, ready to move
Next
on?
section, let's go. Got a lot to do.
Okay. Chapter 7, beginning in verse 11. A day for the building of your walls. On that day the boundaries shall be far extended. On that day they will come to you from Assyria to Egypt, and from Egypt to the river, from sea to sea, and from mountain to mountain. But the earth will be desolate because of its inhabitants, for the fruit of their doings. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock that belongs to you, which lives alone in the forest, in the midst of a garden land. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old, as in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt. Show us marvelous things. The nations shall see by the seashore and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands over their mouths, their ears shall be deaf, and they shall lick dust like a snake, like the crawling things of the earth. They shall come trembling out of their fortresses. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall stand in fear of you.
A lot here.
Yeah. Well, and to me, it's interesting because it kind of turns it towards the nations, the people who are not the people of God, if I'm reading it right. On that day, they will come to you from Assyria to Egypt, from Egypt to the river, kind of looking out beyond the borders of Israel. But the earth will be desolate because of its inhabitants for the fruit of their doings. And so it's like kind of bringing God's judgment to the rest of the world. Shepherd your people. The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. And so it's an encouraging word for God's people. It's encouraging because you're going to be restored, but there's encouragement to say these powerful nations that are the ones, that we're going into exile and they have power over us. Eventually their power will be no more, and God will elevate us, and the nations will see that. And I love that. They shall lick dust like a snake. That's just that image of them being brought low. Nothing's slower than the animal that crawls on its belly and eats dirt, metaphorically speaking. So, yeah, it's a great image of encouragement that Israel is eventually going to come out on top.
I mean, for me, it's a very apocalyptic and a sort of modern apocalyptic portrait. When I think like all these, like we did the Book of Eli, like that's what I think of when it says everything's going to be desolate. Right? There's going to be little outposts where people can come and hang out and have civilization. But generally speaking, it's just mile after mile of desolation and dust blowing, right? And all those sorts of things.
Image.
And that's what I get. And so that's Jerusalem / Israel will be this like oasis, so to speak. And everyone's going to have to go there because it seems like everything else is going to be ruined. Right. And so that's the image I get that he's trying to say. And so we're going to have to expand our borders because the whole world's coming here. Right. And on the one hand, there's practical, we're going to have to expand our borders, but I wonder how much it's also, and you are going to be the power, right? The whole expanding borders and becoming a bigger people. I don't know if that's intended or not, but that, it's for me, it's kind of there, right? When they're going to have to, because the boundaries that God gave you are not going to be big enough. We're going to have to
contain it.
We're going to have to go even more. And so anyway, that's whenever that verse 13, when it's all gonna be desolate, we're like, yep, I think of Book of Eli.
Yeah, and I think when they use "on that day" language, I think that is apocalyptic language. Like often that phrase, there's a section of Isaiah, I think it's 24:27, it's kind of the Isaiah apocalypse, where on this day that's going to happen, and it's this cosmic turnaround. It's when God breaks into world history and sets things right, where there's a dramatic overhaul of the state affairs on planet Earth. I also see in this section a change of voice. It's going to continue for the rest of the book, where it's like the prophet is turning toward God.
Mm-hmm.
It's toward him that people are, and I'm trying to think of like early on, like who's the you, right? Are they streaming to the Israelites, or is it, no, they're coming to God. Which, of course, has implications for the Israelites as God's people. But by the end of it, it's clearly talking about they shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall stand in fear of you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is the you the fear of the Lord that they're turning to, or is you the people of God? I don't know. Like the you here, it seems like they're talking about God, but sometimes it seems like it's talking about the people.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to be God. Because at 14, shepherd your people with your staff. Well, that's God who's doing that. And the days when you came out of the land of Egypt, show us marvelous things. I still think it's talking about God. Because, God came out with them. God led them, right? And then they'll see all these things will happen. So it seems to be that he kind of goes back and forth. He should have said, they will turn in dread to you. But he says Yahweh, which is to maybe reminding the reader. But then he goes, and so they'll stand in fear of you. Like, so you got that sort of parallelism, the psalmist's parallelism, where one he names God and one he says you. So it seems to me that he's talking about God that's doing all these things.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, in this section of hope, the hope that, began in 8, it's all turning toward God. He's the one that's kind of vindicating them before their enemies. He's the one that they seek, the nations will turn toward, right? And he's the one at the end. We're going to read the last oracle here in a little bit, but it's directed toward God. And, cumulatively, the effect of this section is our hope is in God. And he's going to be the source of their vindication. He's going to be the one who provides for them and is their sustainer and their shepherd. And so it's kind of turning to be a theocentric view. The hope is not when you look around to the land or when you look at the young leaders who are being raised up. It's apocalyptic. The help is not coming from down below. The help is coming from up above.
I wonder, there's a fruit callback here, verse 13. The earth will be desolate because of its inhabitants for the fruit of their doings. I wonder if there's a connection to chapter 7, verse 1, right? Because I've been like the one who's been let down because there's no fruit, right? There's nothing left there. And so now it's kind of like, well, you guys, you people, you leaders and the rest of the people have lived in such a way where now there's no fruit for anyone. It's all desolate except for people who are with God. And that, God's going to shepherd and flock them. It's all going to be in the promised land. They're going to have plenty to eat. I don't know if there's a connection between those fruit images between those two things, but it definitely seems to be like there's desolation because of either selfishness, and there's desolation because, I know it seems like God makes it that way, but nonetheless.
I mean, I think fruitfulness is it's a really good image for, people who are primarily agrarian people. Sure. Like, I think just so many Americans are so out of touch with, this idea of fruitfulness, like going out, planting a tree or a garden or something like that, and allowing it to bear fruit that you will literally use for your food. Like, it's just, for them, for the Israelites, this is how they live. Most people go to the store and everything's wrapped up and ready to go for them. And so I think that fruitfulness image is just more, it's more real to them because it's just part of their daily lived experiences. That doesn't mean you're wrong. I'm just saying, I think it just, for them, it's just so much more real. It's very tangible.
The only thing I have growing is I planted a bunch of baby arborvitaes, and they're growing like 2 inches a year. So soon I'll see.
Takes a while.
I'll see the excitement of the
I've been watching them. Every time I drive by, I'm like, how are the little trees doing?
They're doing okay.
I don't think any died, did they?
No.
Yeah, that's great.
I didn't know that you had planted those.
It was, like 15 of them, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Quite a bit.
I planted them a couple feet apart, so ideally they'll grow up together and provide a hedge wall from the road.
Between the road and his fence. So,
okay.
Yeah, you can see them all.
All right, I'm going to pay close
in all their glory.
Yeah. We're trying to shield the shed from all the damage we did.
But that's a story for another time. We did not do the damage. The wind
true.
did the damage. And by we, I mean you and Steve helped restore it to actually a functional shed.
To its previous glory, huh?
So it doesn't matter. I made a mistake. I didn't bolt it down. A wind came and picked it up, and then it bent one side pretty badly.
Oh, okay.
So we just drilled it in and forced it, and it's fine. It's been great since.
We did well. I do want to zoom in on verse 12 a little bit and talk about these boundaries.
Yeah.
From that day, they will come to you from Assyria to Egypt, from Egypt to the river, from sea to sea, mountain to mountain. I mean, those boundaries are kind of familiar ones.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you're talking Assyria to Egypt and Egypt to the river, I'm suspecting this is the Euphrates River.
Mm-hmm.
So those are traditionally the boundaries. They're both the boundaries of the Promised Land.
Yep.
And they're kind of the boundaries that are associated with even the geographic hints we have about the Garden of Eden,
Mm-hmm.
which are supposed to reflect somewhat Promised Land, but there are a couple of geographic references that don't exist anymore.
Right.
So that they've been lost to God barring our way back to Eden. So anyway, I think it's kind of like the expansion of boundaries. It's not like we're going global yet, right? But we're growing to be what God intended us to be, and they keep getting smaller than that as they lose power. It's contracting and contracting. It's going to expand out for God's original purposes, for his people in the land. Would you say that's...
Yeah, so the promise to Abraham, when it gets fleshed out of where the place actually is, it uses similar terminology from the river to Egypt and so forth. And so it does seem to I would assume the readers would echo like, oh yeah, this is what was promised to our ancestors, and we sort of had under David Solomon-ish, and then ever since
At
then
its
we've
peak,
had and then we had less and less every single time. So yeah, I think I agree. It's restoring to what God had already promised them.
Yeah, and then why I bring up Eden, because some of those geographic markers are descriptive of the Garden of Eden, is there is language similar to Eden in this section, and you often see Eden-like language in apocalyptic literature, like it's a callback to something like Eden. You have this garden imagery and language used, and this snake and dust, which is the consequence of the serpent in the fall is you will lick snake like the dust. You will go down to the ground like a serpent. So I wonder if there's some deliberate callbacks to the Garden of Eden.
I mean, I think it's definitely possible because verse 14 just frames it as. So the lack of fruitfulness he mentioned at the beginning of 7 and he mentions in 13 are replaced by they're just going and they're feeding. Like there's plenty of food for all the animals, and it's kind of and it does say as in the days of old.
Right.
I don't know what he means by that. Does he mean during the Abraham era where they kind of wandered around from place to place and ate as they needed to, or does he mean like you say Eden where there's plenty for all? I think both could be possible, and so I think you're right. And then bringing in the snake and the crawling in business is not accidental, right?
Yeah,
That's
licking dust like a snake.
Yes,
that is Eden, the fall language.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
I was thinking the same.
So it's kind of and now that curse is just applied to certain people, right? Implying that it's reversed for other people, perhaps. Yeah,
an Egyptian chaos god we got going on there.
we're getting there.
We'll get there eventually.
Well, we have one more section, and then we'll perhaps have time to draw some big picture conclusions from the book.
Mayhaps. All right, I'll finish it up with 18 through 20. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity, passing over the transgression of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in showing steadfast love. He will again have compassion upon us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our ancestors from the days of old.
The end.
Period. Yeah. As we mentioned, I think way early on, that who is a God like you is Micah or Micaiah, sort of. So it's Micaiah. Well, it's L.
Instead of Yah, it's L.
Yeah. But it's that getting in that idea of these sorts of things.
Play off of his name.
Yeah. And that first verse, verse 18, that is very reminiscent of Exodus 34, when Moses proclaims this great statement about who God is, the one who pardons sin and forgives iniquity and all those sorts of things. And so it's not the full quotation, but there are definitely some parallels between his language there. And I don't know if we have time to talk about.
That's interesting, like even this passing over language, which kind of calls back to the Exodus.
Yeah.
Calls back to God's uniqueness in not staying angry forever.
Yeah, whenever it says steadfast love, it's this word chesed, which we have no translation for in English. We've probably talked about this at some point on the podcast. Covenantal faithfulness, this thing that we don't understand. The best we have is like the faithfulness you show to your husband or wife is getting in the direction of what we're talking about, where you'll do whatever you can to make sure you uphold the sanctity of this relationship. And that's what chesed is. So steadfast love or faithfulness is not quite there. That's why I don't love steadfast love as a translation, because when we use the word love, it brings in these emotional things, and I'm not sure that's really as much part of it as we like it to be.
Well, what stands out to me, because I've tracked this a lot, is that chesed in the Septuagint is frequently translated as mercy. Mm-hmm. They don't translate it as love. Mercy, which in the biblical sense is kindness and concern for somebody in serious need. And so this idea of the steadfast love, for the Septuagint translators, are like agape doesn't do the job. Mercy actually does the job far better.
Yep.
And so I think it's a very interesting way of helping us to understand how this word should be not only understood, but how God applies it to his people and ultimately to us.
But then mercy raises its own problems.
Well, I mean, that's why we have to go back to a more biblical definition. We shouldn't define mercy in a 21st century sense, but how do Bible writers define mercy? It makes me think, like in Luke's gospel, when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, he gets to the end of the story and says, who treated this guy like a neighbor? And the person he's talking to says, the one who showed him mercy. You know, it wasn't just, mercy the way we think about it, but this guy saw him in this horrible situation and said, I got to do something about it. I got to step in and help him. He treats his wounds. He puts him in with somebody who can take care of him while he's gone. He pays his way. He's like, that's what a neighbor looks like. That's what mercy looks like.
Yeah, still.
Not sold. Yeah. Anyway, but my point is that in verse 20, it kind of really comes out. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and chesed to Abraham. Going back to that covenantal expectation and relationship. Like, this is going to happen. And so even in the midst of all the judgment that's been brought out during this book, don't fear that God has given up on you, the people. Right? That's not the God we're talking about. We're talking about the God who, through all of time, you can go back to your whole history, has shown this faithfulness to Abraham and to the covenant God made with him. It's still in place. It's still in effect. And so that's what they rely on, right? That's what they go back to. And because of that, they can have faith that, yes, things are going to change, that God's going to this interesting of treading our iniquities underfoot. I know it's a fascinating reference. I can't think of another one like that, where like enemies, right? You're going to put our enemies under his feet, but then our iniquities, I don't know, that's kind of fascinating. And then the casting our sins in the sea, we see that in other places, but I think this one is kind of unique.
Yeah, and I think they go hand in hand, like casting, who did God cast into the sea? Pharaoh's army.
Right.
And that's what God's going to do to our sin. And what does God do to our enemies? He tramples them underfoot. And that's what he's doing to our iniquities. God's not just defeating the people who have oppressed us. There are the ways that we oppress one another and the way that we harm our own selves through sin and iniquity. God is going to treat that self-inflicted harm as an enemy that he conquers over.
Yep.
Which that does add some interesting depth to God's love for us. He doesn't just, the people from the outside that victimize us. Yeah, he does that. He's going to take care of them, but the ways we victimize ourselves, he's going to deal with that too. And that's a kind of mercy.
Mm-hmm.
No, I totally agree with you. That's what I'm saying. That is a biblical definition.
All right, here's my problem with mercy. And I hate the concept of a biblical definition of mercy because mercy is an English translation of a word, in this case, hesed. So I want the biblical definition of hesed, not a biblical definition of the Greek word that they translated hesed as. You know what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying.
That's my only source of.
I understand what you're saying. Because
mercy does, and maybe your fuller definition avoids that. It implies some kind of debt on our part, like either whether we're in need, like the Samaritan person, like or we deserve something. He doesn't give it to us. He shows mercy. But hesed is in times of not just inequality, where one party is in lacking for one reason or another, and someone shows mercy, but hesed is you show it in times of prosperity. It's this rugged commitment in all times and places, and mercy tends to narrow that.
I think that if you define mercy that way, you are correct, but I do not think that that's how the Bible uses that term. You see that actually doesn't play into it the way modern people think it does. Whenever I try to explain it, those are the very things I say, don't think of it this way. Like this idea of a debt or not getting something you deserve or whatever. I say, you got to throw that out because that's not how, the Bible is treating this term. So,
yeah. But if a word's no longer being used in that full sense, then to keep using it and tell people that they got to totally forget the definition they have for it and then use a different word that doesn't mean that in their mind.
I understand
it becomes
that.
A tricky translation choice.
You're right. It can be tricky. I totally agree with you.
But some words have to be, you have to redeem them. You have to redefine them. And there's no other substitute. So
I know where are we going to go? It's like, I see both sides of that argument. Yeah.
John is espousing the Gen Z view of words. We just throw out definitions and make it what we want, apparently.
Well, sometimes you got to redeem a word that's been soiled.
Right.
And sometimes you just got to leave it behind.
I'm trying.
And pick a better word.
It's not going so well for me. I'm just going to let you know that.
Redeeming words?
Yes. Okay. Javi, Gen Zers, words don't mean anything. I'm sorry to all our Gen Z listeners out there, which are two of you, maybe. Like, it just don't. Like, for example, like GOAT, right? Greatest of all time. So someone who does something good is now called a GOAT. That's not what greatest means. It literally is the very best. And it's like, that was pretty good. You're a GOAT. No, you're not, actually. Anyway, sorry. I'm done now. My apologies for yelling in your speakers.
Yeah. I I think it's cool the way. Well, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of how the book ends by this statement of, God's going to keep the covenant promise He made to Abraham and your ancestors. The fact that prophets hundreds of years later are using the Abrahamic promise as the reference point of things getting back to good is so important.
Yep.
Like when we talk about the Bible story and how the Bible storyline fundamentally begins not with creation, but with the calling of Abraham and that promise. I mean, that's the specific story of Israel. And that is the point that we keep circling back to. And the fact that in the New Testament, in the sermons in Acts, you have Peter and others circling back to the promise made to Abraham. This is one of those kind of midway reference points where the Israelites keep going back to the promises of Abraham as their identity and starting point, and the thing that God's trying to restore and get back to. This is part of the unity of the whole story of the Bible showing itself. So it'd be interesting to kind of plot out these callbacks to Abraham among all the prophets and history books and New Testament books to see just how much Abraham is central to the Bible story. And I say that just because I know Abraham growing up was one of the most famous people in the Old Testament. But, I mean, in terms of key players in the Bible story, it's Jesus, Abraham. The two most, aside from, the Father and the Spirit, Jesus and Abraham are the two human figures that become the reference points of salvation history.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, it's we can't overestimate how important Abraham and this covenant and promise are, because that's what guides the rest of the books, right? Because whether it's seeing its fulfillment or promising that it will be fulfilled, or Jesus coming and bring, it's and what's fascinating to me is this dude in, let's call it the 1800s, Abraham, whatever, BC,
right?
And yet here we are over 1,000 years later, and yet this is still on their minds. The fact that promise stood the test of time and that they continue to have faith in it. It's crazy to think about. I guess we're kind of used to it because, the whole Jesus coming back has been 2,000 years for us too. But how that just guides and frames all their thoughts and all their hopes. It's an interesting study on humanity and the power of this covenant, this hope.
Yeah, and it dispels the notion that some people structure the Bible, or they view the Bible as a series of consecutive covenants. You have the Noah covenant and the David covenant and the Old
the new
covenant and the Abrahamic covenant. It just makes it seem like the Bible is a series of epochs, right? Where one covenant follows the other, and it's once you move on to the next epoch, you leave behind the previous covenants, right? And that's not quite what it is. There's there is a single kind of overarching thing that the whole Bible story is about, and it's how God is accomplishing the covenant to Abraham. And that's what Jesus comes to fulfill. Now, within that big covenant promise, there is, the covenant with the Israelites on Mount Sinai and the covenant with the new covenant made in the blood of Jesus. But all of that takes place within the one Abrahamic promise for all the world. And so you can't ever just put the covenant promise with Abraham on the same level as all the other covenants. This is framing in a totalistic kind of way.
You think Matthew understood that?
Absolutely.
Began his book with genealogy starting with Abraham.
Well, Abraham, David, Jesus are the big ones there. And it's funny because he kind of skips over the Sinai covenant. It's Abraham, David, Jesus. And so, we don't want to lose sight of how important that is. I'm really glad you made that point, John, because I think it's really important to think about how that shaped Israel's identity, their expectations, and how we see it fulfilled in what Jesus is doing. I really appreciate that.
All right. So any big picture takeaways from the book of Micah? We kind of wrapped this whole thing up.
I would say the big one for me is this is we do a lot of in churches and business world, a lot of leadership training. I feel like Micah has something to say about that, about what God thinks about bad leaders or leaders who exploit people. And so I think that'd be an important work to bring into your discussion. Maybe if you're training elders or training leaders in the church, say if you're not in your role, you're not doing it for the sake of the kingdom and for the people, then you're probably doing it wrong. Not probably, you are doing it wrong. And God doesn't look highly on that. Now, they might not be doing such extreme things like exploiting their people and taking advantage of them, but I think some of that happens in churches still, and some of that happens in the business world for sure, even, quote, Christian leaders, Christian business people. And so, that's just one kind of takeaway. Like, God doesn't mess around with that. If you're in a place of leadership, you take it seriously and you put people first, and that's true servant leadership.
Yeah. One thing that stood out to me, and I appreciate that you guys brought it up at the beginning of the series, is talking about how maybe some earlier prophecies that apply to the northern kingdom and the relationship with Assyria get recycled into the southern kingdom, and especially Jerusalem's relationship with Babylon. And that just makes me think about how God can say something at one time, but it doesn't mean it was for that time, and it has nothing to do with any future generations. Because we can look back at the prophets and say, well, that was great for Israel, but what is it speaking to me? And so we can look at these words and still say that, yeah, it had a meaning for Israel and Assyria, or Judea and Jerusalem and Babylon. But how do I can appropriate their language to say, you know what, in many ways, I'm going through a very similar situation. And the same God who was speaking to Israel and speaking to Judah and Jerusalem is the God that we're worshiping to this very day, almost 3,000 years later. And that same word carries a powerful message that we can still appropriate for ourselves as individuals and as communities, and pray to the same God with the same expectation.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, for me, I think to pick a different takeaway,
Good.
I think it would be, and we've seen this a lot in the last chapter, but it's in previous chapters, where the hope of world histories is God, like his intervention in world history. And, our hope is not in a perfect church. Our hope is not in our leaders. Like, our hope is in God. And, because God is our hope, and he has this steadfast commitment to his people, Israel, he has his steadfast commitment to the promise that he made to Abraham, that through his descendants, the whole world would be blessed. It means his people have an important role to play, but his people are not the hope.
Right.
Which is why we always have to be pointing toward God, who is our hope, and try ourselves to be faithful pointers to him and the hope he offers the world, and then be humble about the role that we have to play in it.
I know. A lot of good takeaways from Micah. I hope that the study has helped people appreciate the book, even more so than the past. Really do.
Also, I'm going to do the wrap-up. Well, thank you for joining us.
I think so.
In 2024 for 53 episodes of the After Class podcast. After Class, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to the Afterclass podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.